Something is Something. Book 2 of Stories for Your Inner Child by Steve Gallegos. The Visit. The visit was a surprise to his parents. David knocked at the door of the house where he had grown up. His mother, looking older but happy, came to the door, stared at him for a few seconds, and then exploded in tears of joy. "David, David," she exclaimed, almost speechless. "We didn't know what to think after you had been summoned to the governor's program. How long ago was that? 4 years? 5 years ago? We tried to find out where the program was, but the governor seemed to want to keep it secret, so we thought it must be something very special. Come in, come in." David entered the house. It was much smaller now, smaller than he remembered it being. Father was not at home, but a young child came running in. "Mommy, Mommy, who is it?" she asked. She looked at David with giant eyes and then said, "Is this David?" "Yes, Cornelia, this is your big brother David that we told you about. He's been off at a special school where he went shortly before you were born. Look how big he is. My, how you've grown, David." David was speechless. Then he suddenly remembered something secretive taking place between his parents and learning that they were expecting another baby. But he had not thought about it since leaving with grandfather. Cornelia must have been born not long after he left. He suddenly remembered that a little brother had been born when he was still quite young, and he had sadly died only a month after he was born. Great sadness had loomed in the home after his death, and no one wanted to talk about it, or to explain to David just what death was, or what had really happened to Jeremy. It had left him feeling blank and unsure of himself, like there were things he was not supposed to know, nor to ask about. It had caused him to go quiet and to turn inward. Now he understood why Mother and Father had been so quiet when she was pregnant with Cornelia. They were afraid that she might also die, and so they were wary of saying too much, and they didn't want David to begin asking questions about death again. Their pain from Jeremy's death was still very tangible. Cornelia had great big eyes that looked inquisitively at David. He was a mystery to her, and there was also something very magical about the energy between these two siblings. David sat down on the couch, and Cornelia immediately sat next to him and said, "Tell me about all your adventures in the big world." Next chapter, Where to Begin. David didn't know where to begin. As he sat on the couch with the new sister he had just met, he thought of grandfather, and of Bearman, and of the village where he had come to feel so at home, more at home than he had ever felt here in the house where he had been born and where he had spent his childhood years. This house felt so confining now, so tiny, so shielded from the natural world that he had grown to love and to feel a deep kinship with. He recognized how deeply the natural wildness of the mountains and the sea had become a part of him. That entire wild area had become his home now, and this tiny house where he sat on the couch with Cornelia, with his mother looking on in anticipation, felt more like a prison where aliveness was very limited and restricted. How could he even begin to tell Cornelia or Mother about what he now knew? He realized they would not understand, and that Mother would feel it as a criticism of all that she had done. David recalled the talks he and grandfather had had. He recalled grandfather telling him that some people built their own cages in order to feel safe, without realizing that they were imprisoning themselves. They do that not only with these limiting enclosures that they call houses, but they do that also with their thinking, grandfather had said. They build enclosures of thought that they feel safe in, and are threatened by the thinking of others. They can only recognize whether other people's thinking fits the same pattern as their own, and if it doesn't, they start talking faster and louder in order to fight off the thoughts they feel as threats. Such people confuse their thinking with the actuality of who they are. They don't recognize that thinking is merely a postulation of possibilities, and that as they experience their aliveness, these possibilities change. Thinking is supposed to be alive and dancing, but many people have frozen it into blocks of ice. David could feel Mother's anticipation and expectation as if it were an electric energy in the room, whereas Cornelia's energy was open and curious, the energy of exploration and excitement. And David realized that whatever he said would be heard differently by these two loving beings. So he proceeded slowly, and he spoke so that Mother's fears would not be disturbed, but he was also focused on Cornelia's excited receptivity. David understood immediately that in spite of their close relationship, Cornelia and Mother lived in two very different worlds. The school that I attended, he began, looking at Mother, was an exciting school where learning was really alive. I had to learn not just from books, but from some very powerful adventures that were a part of the curriculum. My teachers were very learned and experienced, with ways of teaching that were beyond anything I had experienced in the small school here. Then he looked at Cornelia, smiled, and continued. It was a school where I learned not only with my mind, but with everything that I am. It was a school that used the natural world as its setting and its laboratories, and we learned from everything that happens. Oh, it is so difficult to describe because it's so unlike our usual schools. Well, it sounds very different, Mother said, and I can see that you've grown bigger and much stronger than you were when you left. But I don't understand why we couldn't visit you there. We tried to find out by writing to the governor's office where it was, but we received the strangest replies, and it felt like they just wanted to keep the whole thing secret. Yes, said David, it's a new experimental school, and they wanted to validate its methods before it was made generally known to the public. That's why the students were so secretly and specifically selected. I was very lucky to have been chosen. I want to go there, Cornelia replied excitedly. Next chapter, Cornelia. What David had told his mother and Cornelia was not really a lie. Grandfather had told David that it was wrong to lie, and in fact David had already learned that long ago. But Grandfather had also taught David that you had to use words that could be understood by the person you were talking to. David knew that if he were to describe his meeting with the bear in the mountains, that Mother would have been shocked and terrified, and would never have understood what an important learning this had been for David. In fact, she would have stopped listening to David, and would have gotten embroiled in everything that she feared. That would have been the end of any communication with her. David would have loved to have her understand the beauty of everything he had experienced in the village, but he knew he had to tell her very gradually, so that she would not get lost in her own unresolved emotions. David could see the cage of words and feelings that she lived in, and he knew it was not easy to help a person get beyond these, especially if they were not ready to. And David hoped that someday he would be able to help Mother return to the foundation of her natural aliveness, rather than living in the cage of her words and unresolved feelings, just as Grandfather had helped him to do. But he also knew that it would have to happen very gradually. But Cornelia was a different matter. David could feel the surge of her aliveness, the pull of her curiosity, and her strong will to know a bigger world. He knew she was at a place where she was really ready to grow. Mother suddenly said, "I've got to go finish preparing supper. Your father will be home soon. Cornelia, why don't you show David how we have decorated the room he used to live in and made it yours?" "Yes, I'd love to see it. What have you done to it?" Cornelia was delighted to take David to see her room, and he was surprised at the great change. The few posters he had on the wall were no longer there, and the room had been painted pink and soft blue. There were frilly curtains on the windows, and the bed was piled high with soft stuffed animals and dolls. David suddenly had an idea of how he could begin to help Cornelia. "Which is your favorite animal?" he asked her. "Oh, I love the giraffe," she answered immediately, picking up the soft giraffe with a long neck and hugging it. "What is Giraffe's name?" "Oh, I call her Jessie." "So Jessie's a girl?" "A girl giraffe, silly." "Does Jessie ever talk to you?" "Of course. How do you think I know her name?" David was delighted to hear these answers. "I had an elephant that used to talk to me when I was younger, but no one could see him, and I never told Mom and Dad about him," said David, knowing that he was deliberately telling another human about Elephant for the very first time. Cornelia stared at David with an unsettling look. Next chapter. Dad. Dad arrived home and was shocked to see how big David had grown. He was bigger than Dad. Not only that, but he was husky, strong, muscular, like an athlete, but an athlete skilled in dance, lithe, quick, and yet there was also a stillness in him. Dad was very taken aback. His son was much more mature than he was, and he had no experience in how to react to this. Dad was very happy to see David, for even in all his confusion, he loved David. But he had no idea how to be with David. He felt he needed to play the role of father, yet he felt much smaller and younger than his own son. Dad was confused, but it was really only a part of the confusion he had always felt. It was not really anything new. By then, Mother had prepared supper, and they all sat down at the table. Cornelia couldn't wait to begin talking. "David told me that when he was a little boy he had a toy elephant that he used to talk to, just like I talk to my toy animals and dolls." Both parents sat in shocked surprise. Mother said, "David, I don't remember you having a toy elephant." Cornelia continued in a great rush, "Only it wasn't a real toy elephant, but a pretend toy elephant that no one else could see, and he never told anyone else about it." David was just as shocked as his parents, for he had intended this to be a private communication between himself and Cornelia. He suddenly realized that Cornelia was much more open with her parents than he had been as a child. She seemed to have no protective boundaries around what she said to them. She seemed unafraid of their comments and judgment. And David began to see the emotional environment he had grown up in was much different from that of Cornelia. He also began to consider that perhaps he wasn't the only one to have changed during these past years while he was at the village. Maybe his parents had also changed. Father seemed to be getting more and more uncomfortable and said, "Mother, this is a fine dinner that you've prepared for us." But Cornelia was unstoppable. "I'm so happy to get to finally meet you, David. Mother and Father always told me I had a big brother, but I didn't know he was as big and as strong as you. I really want to hear about your adventures. And why didn't you write more? Mother and Father were very proud and happy to get your letters while you were away, but there were so few of them. They would read them to me, and you never told us very much about what you were studying and about where the school was, so that we could go and visit you." Next chapter, Stories. David knew that he would have to tell them some stories about the time he had been away, and he knew the stories must be truthful. Yet he also understood he would have to speak in a language that his parents understood. He would have to talk in the ideas that they knew, at least at first. Perhaps later they would be open to hearing things that were more precise and true to his own experience and to what he had experienced with Bearman and Grandfather. So he began by translating some of the events into the language that his parents knew about school. First of all, it was a very full curriculum, he said, so there was very little time to write or for personal events. The school was an experimental school, like a natural laboratory, full of individual experiences in the way that nature functions. The professors were highly qualified in their particular fields, and were relentless in their supervision of the students' activities and schoolwork. We were active from daybreak until sundown, so that all I could do at night was to sleep deeply. There was really no time to go to the movies or to hang around street corners. He smiled as he said this. Mother and father nodded knowingly and with fond approval. They understood that David's time had been well spent in learning, and the elegance of his language testified to this. Father said, "It sounds like a fantastic school, but I don't understand why it has been kept so secret. The governor's office was unwilling to tell us anything at all about it. We wrote to them several times inquiring about you and about the school, and they seem to insist on keeping everything secret." "Yes," said David, "since it is a pilot program, they want to study the results thoroughly before it's instituted on a broader scale. It was an honor to have been selected for such a specialized program. It was especially appreciated that you both had allowed me to enter this program, given such short notice." "Yes, well, we trust the governor and the way he runs this state," said Father, with not a little pride in his voice. Next chapter, Cornelia's dream. Just as Father finished speaking, Cornelia suddenly blurted out, "I just remember the dream I had last night. It was scary. In the dream, Mother was reading me a story, and I was all excited because I was getting ready to start school, and I knew I would be learning to read and to write. I love the stories that Mother reads to me every night when I go to bed, and I was so happy because I knew I would be learning to read stories myself and also to write stories. While she was reading to me, I fell asleep, and I was walking to school with Jessie, and we were both really happy and excited. On the path to school, we had to go through a tunnel that went under the street, and as we were going through it, the tunnel got littler and littler, until it was very tiny, and we could just barely crawl along it. And it got so tiny that Jessie couldn't go any further because she was so tall. So I had to leave her behind. I started to cry because I didn't want to leave her. Her body didn't fit in the tunnel anymore because it was so tight. And so she stretched her neck out, and I carried her head with me, and her neck got skinnier and skinnier, and then her head was too big, and so she stuck out her tongue, and it got longer, and I just had her tongue in my hand. But then it got too slippery, and I suddenly let go of it, and it was dark, and I was very scared. I started to cry, and then I woke up, but I was still scared. Mother said, "Oh, Cornelia, it was just a dream. It wasn't real. You don't need to pay any attention to it. Come, eat your supper." David knew he had returned home just in time. Next chapter, the guest room. That evening was relatively uncomfortable. The family sat around the TV set, watching the evening news until Father announced that he had some work to do and left. Mother seemed unwilling to ask David more about his school, almost as if she really didn't want to know anything more. David was glad he didn't have to translate any more about his life for the past few years, but Cornelia was very intense and kept looking at David as if she needed to learn more about him, but she didn't inquire further. Suddenly Mother announced that she was very tired and that it was also Cornelia's bedtime, and that she hoped David would be comfortable sleeping in the guest bedroom. Alone in the guest bedroom, David's mind was racing. He had never slept in this room before, and since they seldom had guests, the room had been used mainly for storage and for hanging extra clothes in the closet. The bed was stiff and cold, and David longed for the lovely furs that he had slept under in the long house. Everything here felt so sterile and lifeless. Even his parents felt like they had each retreated to the very center of their cages and were even afraid to approach their own boundaries and meet the world. David understood that these were elements of their own aliveness that each of his parents feared, and that they were lost in this new situation each searching for a program of how to behave in this unanticipated circumstance. David understood that he was a threat to them. Not that he was in fact a threat, but that he now lived in a fullness of himself that enticed his own parents to move into a place within themselves that they had long ago learned to fear. The place of natural wholeness and aliveness both enticed and threatened them, but this fear was also part of who they had become. David did not know how long he would be able to live here with them again, and besides, he longed for the boisterous life of the village, its relaxed ease, and the presence of grandfather and of Bear Man. Just then he heard a light tap at the door. He thought it was Mother, but when he said, "Come in," he was surprised to see Cornelia slink quietly into the room. "I couldn't sleep," she said. There was an intense glow in her eyes, and she seemed full of unexpressed words and thoughts. David looked at her, and he could feel her young mind stretching and searching, looking for the words that could express something that even she didn't know, but something that longed for answers. Suddenly she said, "Tell me more about your invisible elephant." David realized he must be truthful with her. "Elephant came to me at a time when I was very uncomfortable here at home and also in school." "I'm also uncomfortable at home," said Cornelia. "Sometimes I feel like there's not enough room for me just to be here, that there's not enough air to breathe, and that Mommy and Daddy are uncomfortable with everything I say. I see them kind of flinch when I talk. But I have so looked forward to going to school where I can learn new things and how to read and write." "I know what you mean about there not being enough room in this house and with Mother and Father," answered David. "That's the way I felt too. I felt like I was in a cage, and I didn't understand why Father said the things to me that he said, or why Mother was always after me to be different. But school was not the solution. School was even more restricted, and what I was to do was always determined by the teacher and had very little to do with me. I felt they were trying to turn me into a robot, and I didn't know what to do about it until Elephant came to me." Yes, I knew that is what I needed to hear from you. Tell me about Elephant." Next chapter, Elephant. Elephant was always with me. He would wake me up in the morning with a gentle, friendly smile. I always felt that he loved me, not like Mother or Father, but like a dear friend who really cared what happened to me. He was so gentle, and he always understood me, and he helped me to know how to be here at home and also at school. And he helped me to understand that I had to leave school, and that I had to leave home. He helped me understand that Mother and Father and my teacher, although they did care for me, just wanted me to live in a very limited way, and really didn't want me to change and to grow and to fully become who I am. I always felt that Mother and Father and the teacher all just wanted me to remain a little obedient boy who would do everything they told me to do, even if those things had nothing to do with who I am. Yes, tell me more." Elephant was extremely kind, but also very strong. He knew I needed to be me, just like he needed to be an elephant. He told me that elephants have very special talents that no other animal has, not even people, and that it was important for him to learn how to use those talents and to practice them, because no one else in the world could do it, so that it was his responsibility to develop and use and get to know the talents that were specifically his. That was the job he was given in this world, and that each person also has very special talents and qualities that no one else has, and that the only way someone can know this is to discover them for himself. If a person has qualities no one else has, then how could anyone else teach him about them? The only way for him to know them is to go on a journey of discovery and to find them for himself. Elephant taught me that a person is like a treasure hunt, and that we may not know where the treasure is hidden, but that we have to search for it until we find it, and then the treasure itself will help us to know how it is to be used. This is the problem I had at home and also at school. People there just wanted me to be like everyone else, and to act like everyone else, and to do the things that everyone does. But if I did that, I would never really get to know myself. I would always see myself only in comparison to everyone else, and I would never really get to know my own presence. Elephant taught me that presence is essential, and that it is one of the greatest gifts that we have, one of the greatest gifts that any being has. Every animal knows naturally how to be present, but only people learn to hold back their presence and learn not to trust it. Yes, I knew it. Cornelia was overpowered with joy. She felt like she had been waiting all her life to hear these things. But there are other things that Elephant taught me, and not only Elephant, but the real teachers I've had. We are never alone. We are full of alivenesses of all kinds on the inside. All of life fills us and advises us if we are willing to listen to it and to talk to it. And the aliveness in us calls the aliveness around us. That is how Grandfather knew to come get me and to take me to the place where I could really learn and grow. Your grandfather came to get you? Not Father's mother or Mother's father, but a wise man who is grandfather to many people and who also became grandfather to me. He heard me cry out for a real teacher, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing, and so he came for me. I knew it, cried Cornelia. That's why you've come for me. David was startled to hear this. He knew he had felt pulled to come back to this little house where he had first lived, but now he was beginning to understand why the pull had been so strong. Next chapter, the pull. David didn't know where to begin with Cornelia, or even if he should. He recalled being in the village and telling Grandfather that he was feeling a need to go back home. Grandfather looked at him, and that look went all the way through him, as if Grandfather were seeing something so deep in David that even David didn't know it was there. Tell me about this feeling, said Grandfather. I have trouble finding the right words for it. I don't want to leave the village, and I know that being here with you and Bear Man and all the people in the village is the best thing that has ever happened to me. And still, there is this strange feeling deep in my belly that says I should go home. I don't understand it, but the feeling is very persistent. Grandfather's look changed, became wider and warmer, and David felt as if he were being hugged by Grandfather's feeling. He told Grandfather this, and Grandfather said, Yes, it is true. This is a deep call, and one that you're listening to, even though to your thinking mind it doesn't seem to make much sense. Why don't you talk to this feeling? Maybe it is more than a feeling. Maybe it is the energy of some animal inside of you. Ask if that is so. By now David was well used to Grandfather's curious way of teaching. So he closed his eyes and focused on the feeling and asked, Are you an animal? Immediately a slinky otter appeared behind David's closed eyes. The otter looked at David and suddenly said, Come swim with me, and dove directly into the river. David followed without question. He found Otter swimming skillfully against the river's current, winding his way through the various smaller streams that flowed within the river. David realized that the river was not just a single thing, but consisted of many smaller, thinner currents, each with its own shape and speed, and the otter was skillfully weaving its way along one of these as if it were a wet path through the river itself. Then it dove through a small underwater opening in the bank of the river, through a short tunnel, and upward into a warm and cozy cave. David followed Otter into this enclosure and then realized that it was Otter's home. In this home cave were 2 older otters and a younger one. David knew that this was Otter's family. The 2 older ones came up and sniffed Otter, and then David. These were Otter's parents. The younger one came up and joyfully nuzzled Otter, and was obviously overjoyed to see him. David told all of this to Grandfather, who was sitting by his side, and Grandfather said, "Ask Otter if there is anything else." David did so, and Otter shook his head. Grandfather said, "Thank Otter for guiding you to this knowing, and then come back here to me." David thanked Otter and Otter's family, and opened his eyes. Grandfather's eyes were sparkling. "Now you know why you have to go home right now. It is not for you, but for someone else who calls you. Perhaps they don't even know they're calling you, just as you didn't know you were calling me when you did. But it is important to pay attention to this call.